Welcome and good afternoon to this webinar on establishing a Service Management Office 2.0. My name is Troy Jumoulet, and I'm a Vice President with Pink Elephant in responsibility of research and development, and I've been with the organization now for over 18 years. And in that time, I've had the opportunity and privilege of working with many different companies on establishing their process governance structures, their service ownership models, and I've seen an interesting evolution, which is the basis for our session today, around the structural changes that organizations often adopt to continue to improve their investment on aspects of their service management journey, but also to even go beyond what we might consider in the ITIL space into just general service management, incorporating aspects of lean and agile and DevOps and project management, in fact. Our last conference we're just recently come back from at Pink 16 in Las Vegas, there were at least 2 or 3 different case studies, all speaking about their journey around this topic of Service Management Office. And it's exciting to see the changes and the progress we're making in this context. This session is going to be recorded so that we can share that link with you following the session, that you can share that with your coworkers and colleagues, as well as if you have any specific questions that you'd like me to address as I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to put them into the Q&A, and I'll address those questions at the end of our session today. I should have time to go through at least a few. All right, so with that, I'll go on right now and to continue. I know that there are some people still logging in, and I'm getting a question, I'm unable to hear any dialogue. Should I be able to hear anything right now? Well, yes, that's ideally the case, and I'm hoping that you'll log in on voice over IP in a few minutes. Okay, so let's talk about the goal. The goal here in general, before we even begin talking about process consistency, because that's actually a means to an end still. But the overall goal is, of course, the creation and delivery of value to our customer base. Those are service consumers, those are organizations, whether they're external to your organization or their internal line of business, there is a consumer that you're providing value to in the means of products and services which are enabled by process. And so this is where we enter the world of lean thinking, that to deliver value, you have to understand value streams. This is the context of a process where I have a goal at the end of this process, I have raw input, and I have to transform this outcome, whether it's a development type process or it's a support type process, a planning type process. It produces something of value out the other end. And in that context, there's a couple of key elements we want to focus on. One is if we're in a value system, like I'm describing, you would hope and you would plan on all of the different agents, the actors in this value stream, to have a common set of core beliefs, a core set of priorities. They share an understanding of what comes first, what comes second, what comes third. So this aspect of shared belief and commonality of belief and better yet practice would be one of the critical success factors to delivering value in a consistent and repeatable and ideally faster and improving method over time. So the whole focus of this is that we need to find a way to bring a commonality of belief into what today for many of us is a silo-based culture. And that silo simply isn't silos within the context of your internal organization, the premise of dev versus ops, and better yet dev and ops or DevOps without any kind of separation. But it also includes, as you see on this diagram, external suppliers. Because one of the things that people often fail to realize is that part of your value chain are the suppliers you choose as strategic partners to be introduced into how you deliver outcomes. And I personally am of the opinion that the word outsourcer is probably a bad term, because in this context we almost build an artificial premise that we're giving work outside of the family value chain. What's actually happening is when you integrate a supplier into your supply chain model, into your value stream, into your process, you're actually adopting that family member inside, albeit an adopted family member, your practice and belief aspect. So that aspect of integrating the supplier into your value chain is also a consistency issue. So this interesting premise is that if we're going to go fast, we have to go fast together. And this is part of the goal of the Service Management Office. It's a function we're going to come to see that has a goal to look at a given process and or value stream to say, how do I gain a commonality of belief, a commonality of practice, a commonality of principle? But more than that, now let's look across the collective participation of all these different agents within my system, and how do I remove things like waste and bottlenecks to improve lead time overall, to continually improving the speed at which we deliver value as well, which is a very lean-focused aspect, in which, in my opinion, is a major and critical skill set of a service management office, the concept of lean thinking and understanding. So before we go on, though, I've had multiple conversations about what does a common process look like. I remember one conversation with an organization that was attempting to establish a common process on a global scale. And now we're talking multiple countries, not just internal silos. And there are different ways to look at the word common. None of these are right or wrong. It's simply, we have to understand, what do we mean when we use that concept? Well, think about it in this way. Here's kind of a dial. For the far right, you have a high level of variability. Now again, from a lean premise, high level of variability, it has some consequences. High level variability means a lot of custom, a lot of specialized, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because specialized outcomes for specific clients, that's possibly good. You'll get a lot of creativity, which is also good from the point of view of innovation. So when you have an organization which decides willfully to enable and actually even promote various process areas to be variant on each other, this is not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to creativity, but it does have other consequences. So a high degree of variability creates a high degree of complexity. A high degree of complexity increases the rate of risk, or the level of risk you're going to actually need to live with. That will potentially, of course, have a element of defect, which is introduced because of the complexity. All of these things have consequences on the concept of speed. High variability reduces speed. It reduces velocity, maybe a better word. And it also, of course, incurs a higher degree of cost, because I'm living, either intentionally or unintentionally, with a high degree of variability in the concept of just redundant ways we do things. So while this do your own thing sounds like it might be a negative, don't necessarily think of it that way, because there are certain value streams or processes in your organization where you will want to value higher levels of variability. Again, they're engineering or perhaps specific types of development processes around non-core business services. These are areas you're going to want to promote even a little bit of chaos to increase the innovation context. So that right-hand side is basically there is no standardization. Now move one to the left of that, we have this concept of a center of excellence. Now, that can mean different things for different organizations, but in this context, what it means is you have a group that has come together and they've built a competency. They've developed collateral, some templates, some artifacts, and you are enabling organizations who want to get good at the ABC process by saying, here is knowledge, here is information, here is templates, here are templates, here are a number of artifacts you can leverage and speed your own development of whatever the thing is you're doing or achieving. So in this context, we're creating a competency area, but we're not trying to control execution or assure standardization. So both of these are, we'll call them uncontrolled execution. There's no desire to maintain a level of consistency across whatever scope of the organization we're focused on. Moving now to the left of the dotted line, we now begin to look into what we'll call controlled execution. So Core Plus is a concept of, we have a process that's been defined, and we have a set of core beliefs, practices, and principles, maybe even down to a set of procedures that have to be consistent across the scope of this organization/entity. Now, the reality is that it's a core set of things that must be true across all groups, but above and beyond core, You allow for variation because of regional variances and specific services that are offered, perhaps different technologies which are used to do the outcome that you're looking to achieve. And so in that context, Core Plus allows for a degree of variability above a core set. And then finally, on the left-hand side, you have this concept of standardized. Now we're getting the speed and the velocity and the lower cost and the lower friction process that you're looking for, but of course that comes with a cost, because now that high degree of standardization will be something that of course will lower the possibility of creativity and innovation. But again, the key is think about all the different processes that in your organization. You will want to actually have various processes at various levels of this model. Not everything hard right, obviously, neither everything hard left, because there are some processes like perhaps change management where you want to have a standardized approach, or incident management for service restoration. But on the right-hand side, you might have other areas, as I mentioned, in the engineering aspect. A service management office needs to work in a world of understanding that business drives the needs for formality, and they move whatever process they're focused on to the right level of standardization based on the need of the organization for that process. So this is a bit of context I want to bring, that it's not about we move everything up this theoretical model of CMMI level 5 maturity, because actually that might be detrimental in the larger scheme of things. But someone has to basically help the organization find the fit for purpose level for the various thing you're working on improving. So moving on from here, why in this case do we want a service management office in the first place? And haven't we been getting along fine? Well, actually, probably you would acknowledge that's not the case. Our silo mentality that we live in today is more vertically aligned to optimizing specific technical domains or specific silos. And we don't necessarily have a problem in the vertical optimization, but where our challenge is coming in the horizontal delivery model. This is where we gain requirements in the plan side. We develop blueprints. We take those blueprints and we make them into design. We assess development activity or project to apply. We do testing and validation against the original requirements. We move that into production and we get to support it. At the end, strategy, design, transition, operation, demand, plan, build, run, pick your set of words. But the reality is we live in this macro value stream. And if that's the case, then what function or structure in your organization would look at value streams and processes horizontally across this organization, which is made up of multiple different supplier models, both internal and external, and help the organization to fine-tune its processes to the appropriate level of standardization required? So this is actually an interesting question, because in my experience, many organizations which are more technically oriented lack pretty much any enterprise function that has that kind of purview, that actually looks at things across silos. And this is actually in itself one of the interesting things to observe, is that the service management office is an enterprise function, often beginning in its journey in a world where we don't have enterprise functions. So what does a service management office do? Well, it is a function. So in that context, it is a specific organizational department or structure. So it exists. There are people who have a job title that belongs to a department or function called the service management office. So obviously here in our conversation, it's driving consistency of a service management strategy. Now, it's interesting to note, again, in my experience, what happens often is an organization will adopt service management principles and they'll divide and conquer, if you will. They'll hand the change management process to this team, the incident process over here, the config process goes to the tools group over there, and literally everyone basically goes out and becomes prosperous and creates these processes, but in silo. We actually end up with different processes on different tools, all needing the same common database. And what I've ended up doing is I've actually now established more silos as opposed to improve the situation by actually not aligning a consistent approach to service management across the various groups. So even the concept of defining a model, like a prioritization model, So think about that. And in the context of incident management, this is probably something that you are familiar with. You're coming up with a model that describes a level of impact and urgency. So I will call it just priority. And it's a simple premise that if we're going to have a shared practice of support, then everyone in that practice or process should agree in premise what is big and what is small. And this defined priority model allows me to establish service level agreements and gain agreement on how fast people move based on what needs to be fixed. So that priority model, again, something you're very familiar with in the context of a support process, would also be a model that is applied to other processes. So you could apply priority to problems. So the SLA on determining a root cause for a priority 1 problem versus a priority 4 problem would be different. You could apply priority to a change where certain changes need to jump a queue in a scheduling system if they're a higher priority. The same thing to a release in the concept of scheduling. The same thing in the context of even services can actually be predefined as higher priorities than others based on their use within the business context of mission. Certain services, for example, would be direct revenue generating services and others indirect. And I can pre-classify these services in that context so that when I tie them onto an incident ticket, they literally trigger SLAs based on that pre-classification. I'm giving you an example of where one policy called a prioritization model would have to be designed in such a way that it actually cohesively holds together your entire service management strategy around various processes. A service management office would have that kind of holistic perspective of understanding how that needs to happen. It's often the case where we look at the service management office as well as kind of the home of continual service improvement. In the premise of just, we need this process to do something better than it's currently doing, or we need to come up with a higher level of standardization, we need to look at this from a lean efficiency, optimization of lead time, and removal of waste. The CSI office is often housed or homed within this structure. Understanding transparency. So another element that often comes out of here is service level management is often a process we'll see that actually often lives in the service management office. The creation of service management dashboards, the publishing of these dashboards for use for governance or business relationship management engagement, and understanding supplier requirements. This transparency and this reporting aspect is key to this. And I mentioned supplier quite a bit already, but one of the roles and the goals of Service Management Office is to make sure that we're treating those suppliers as those adopted family members, and they're part of the improvement, not just outside of the family table. So that increased supplier integration, another key element. All of this ideally is helping you with your silos to identify them and to create bridges across them. And we're also, in essence, beginning to create a structure of governance which holds together these service management activities and processes. And we'll talk about that more explicitly in a couple of different slides as we come up. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of goodness happening on this slide. And the key question is, who is doing this today in your organization? Because it's not probably going to be one process owner, right, that does this for everyone. Or if it is process owners, they're all doing it from their one perspective of each process. But who's doing it from a service management overall perspective? And this is where the beginning of that need arises. Now, getting to the service management office is a bit of a journey for most organizations. So let's start at the beginning. Step one looks like this. An organization begins to adopt service management processes, and they are looking at it from, okay, we've got this process called problem management now. I need to establish this process across this, right now, very technically oriented vertical structure. And I want to enable this process by establishing a process owner, because that's a key control. Control simply means something that I do to make sure that the process that I improve keeps ticking, and next time I come looking is still there and preferably better than I left it. So without an owner who basically emotionally cares and feeds for this process, the chances of any of that happening are very slim to none. So we establish process owners, but we don't have this SMO concept, this service management office right now. It's not even a glimmer in someone's eye, and that would mean new headcount, and we just don't have the budget for that. So let's find, in this context, someone within the existing technical structure that will have a passion and interest for this process, and they'll willfully take it on, whether they're volunteering or being voluntold. That's another question. But the reality is we find someone in this context to own this thing. Now, the positive here is that we haven't had to hire any new headcount. That's all good. But the downside is that we probably haven't hired any new headcount. So chances are you might be one of these process owners, and you either put your hand up or were given this as a gift. But you also are managing a functional team. You have responsibilities in projects that you're accountable for. In essence, you're heavily burdened already. So what often happens in this context is while organizations begin here, they find that this is a very limiting model over the longer term because the process doesn't get the care and feeding it needs, and often may even slide back from the initial improvement made. So this, while it's an initial starting point, neither good nor bad, is often a short-term solution. So what eventually happens in most organizations is the realization of this challenge of capacity begins to be an issue. And so they create, on the left-hand side of this structure, an emerging service management team or department. Think of your own name. And what's happening here is that they move to a more of a centralized process ownership model. So for the first time, I actually have an org chart structure that exists that actually has some context to service management. And in that context, I might have some people that I've tagged and say, okay, congratulations, you're going to be the CSI manager, or you're the service level manager, or you're the process owner, but because you have this as now your full-time job, you will be the process owner for change, release, and configuration management. In and of itself, not a bad thing from the point of view of multiple processes in one hand, but in that exact combination, maybe not very positive because of the high volume of all three of those. But those are things we think about at this point. We have this group that is emerging. It's usually small, a couple people under a senior leader that is a peer at the director or VP level at the IT function. So there's a goodness here because you've got now service management getting some respect, in the words of Raji Dangerfield, because now I have a senior leader that actually has some political capability in the structure. I begin to see visually that this process actually does have an enterprise overview. And the interesting thing is this actually visually on the structure promotes this because now I understand that change management is something that's across the board. In the previous structure, it was still true, but when I try to give you that message, okay, change management or incident management is an enterprise process, but when you look at this and you say, well, I hear your words, but the reality is it belongs to such and such a group. So this new structure that we're seeing here begins to promote the concept of enterprise for the first time. Now, interesting that I say enterprise, it's a loosely worded term, because probably in most of your experience, what we're talking about is operations. Because while service management is an enterprise concept, strategy design being pre-production, most organizations, if they're going to adopt service management, come in through ops. And that's largely an overall governance issue, not an ITIL or service management premise. But when I say enterprise here, we're looking now, we're talking about maybe an infrastructure process versus a enterprise IT process. But again, this is the context in which you world lives right now. So, we find that that is the case at this model, or at this point in the model. What's interesting as well is that now we have the ability to identify we are living in a matrix organization. And everyone here on this call already is living in a matrix organization, meaning you have more than one point of accountability. You have a responsibility to a functional manager, the department you actually belong to. But you are also probably temporarily assigned to projects. So you have accountabilities to project managers or scrum masters, depending on the method you use. You're also, though, and have always been part of cross-functional work where you go to these meetings for fixing things, for moving things, for planning things. Before you ever heard the word ITIL, this was true. The reality is we've always been in cross-functional activity. It's just ITIL helps to clarify what that is. The reality is you have responsibility and accountability to that set of tasks as well. The importance about this is not that you're in a matrix, because you are, because you all have multiple points of accountability. It's how do you define the ability for clarity of understanding about when you prioritize one type of work over another. And the only way to live in a matrix world is to identify you have one and to create policies like the prioritization model we talked about earlier, where everyone agrees when it's a priority 1 or 2 incident, we all drop all the other work we're doing and we go into this. The Service Management Office helps to develop the policies that drive the ability to work effectively in a matrix organization. Okay, so we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, but we begin here. This emerging service management group and team begins. Now, I'm going to add a little bit more to the context of governance before we move into the next phase. So let's talk about process governance. So a key premise is that this process is consistent over the various structures. Okay, so here we have an example of 3 organizations. Organization 1 is external, 2 and 3 are internal. You know, call them whatever you like, but the key is there's 3 different major silos. Now on the right-hand side, you see the process owner. Now I've used process manager, and I'll call it a small p process owner explicitly on the left. I'll come back to that, but here's the key premise. For any given process, you still need one individual, and that's a single individual, to be accountable for the overall process in the context of whatever scope that process spans. It doesn't mean that person has to be a dictator in the context of designing that process for fit for purpose, or the sole person responsible for deploying that process organizationally. So let's say we had this mix here. The 3 organizational roles would work with the enterprise process owner in designing the process to be fit for purpose for that organization collectively, so that we, the people, all agree that this is the way we work from this point forward. Now, there's a dotted line or solid line then from those organizational managers/owners to the enterprise owner. It is possible that that process owner on the right could be one of the ones in the structure. It doesn't have to be a 4th person, but the reality is there's still one point of accountability, because shared accountability is not functional. So this is a key premise. Now, another part of that governance structure conversation is that when they now have collectively designed this process for fit-for-purpose use across the structures, it's now the objective and the task of the vertical manager or owner to deploy that process within their own structure. So that's a key aspect. They're the individual from that department, from that region, from that organization, which is identified as that regional process owner, and they are responsible to collectively do this as a team. Now, let's take key performance indicators, for example. So one of the things that they're going to collectively design is a measurement system that says, here are the 4 KPIs, let's say, that we're going to collectively measure in a consistent fashion in each structure. Each vertical would be responsible for rolling out that KPI package within their vertical structure, and they would then be able to show that for each of these structures. But then I can roll this up to now a dashboard at an enterprise level, because they're using each the same context of measurement. So now I can look at it from an overall process perspective as well as a specific segmented perspective. Now, to expand on this further dialogue, one process is, a challenge, but the reality is that you have multiple processes. And I'm using this in a very vague way on purpose, because it could be more than just service management we're talking about. It could be an IT asset management, could be an architecture, it could be security. All of these things apply. These principles apply to all of the above. So let's now say we lift it now to more of a service management or system perspective. Now, ITIL, just leave it at that for the moment, is a very integrated framework. As we know, pretty much every process has some connection, either direct or indirect, with any other ones. So it's kind of like a room full of chairs. Picture this in your mind. And they're all connected by strings. You kick over the chair in front of you, two beside it fall over. The one in the back of the room moves 6 inches. So it's critical that you now have a governance structure above the individual process layer that understands the systemic impact and relationship of the various processes. I gave you an example of that priority model, but let's use change management, because if I make a change to the change management process design, it could literally kill release or configuration management. So this council of ITSM governance is largely responsible for a couple of key elements, one of them being changes to the core design of the processes. Think of it as the change advisory board for process changes. Yes, process changes. Now, who is on this council, this ITSM governance board? Well, ideally, each of the enterprise process owners would have a seat on this. You might have a chair. That chair might be the owner of the service management office. We're going to come back to in a minute. But on that governance council, you're probably going to have a tool owner, because now the tool is highly dependent on this integration concept. If you're under audit or regulatory requirement, you may have audit in attendance, at least as an advisor. All of this is critical if you're going to tie together this premise of an enterprise service management structure and governance. Above that governance council, though, is an ITSM executive. So these are the sponsors for the original projects. The dashboard that we see coming out of every process is now being rolled up to an ITSM dashboard, which is a key artifact that's delivered to your executive team who's interested in service management overall. The ITSM Governance Council is also the one who's building the business case based on the next wave of improvement that you're actually identifying, and building that and providing it to the ITSM executive as input into decisions on continual service improvement. They're also, in this context, holding the process ownership structure accountable for closing gaps that are identified through measurement and CSI improvement opportunities. So this scaled and federated process ownership model is a critical thing that needs to be enabled to keep all the hard work that you're doing glued together, and it often will find its home as far as the organizing structure within a service management office. That's not to say that all of the process owners exist in the SMO, because that's not true. We will talk about that in a few slides to see where we see this happening, but it's an interesting premise that it does hold the overall governance structure together. Okay, so this next slide represents kind of phase 3. The first phase was that very functionally oriented, find a home for a process owner within the existing structure. The second phase was the emergence of a baby service management team. Now what's happening is this. Some good things have happened. You've identified through some measurement and through some SLAs key gaps that you've closed. You've been able to demonstrate how you've integrated suppliers in a much more effective and meaningful way. You've done some Kaizen, lean, waste, and value stream improvement events. And so you've actually shown where you've saved money on improving cycle time and lead time, and your process cycle efficiency is improving. All of this is good. And you get rewarded for all this goodness by getting more work. So what happens now is this group now becomes more formal. The leader might become more senior, and you begin to see this organization emerge now and be given new tasks. So let's say you have, for example, you have an analyst type of team around that's basically creating dashboards for various reasons. You might see that performance management group now introduced as part of the SMO. Or maybe you do kind of a learning and development training coordination. The service management office might actually get there as well. I was speaking with one of our case study speakers at the conference last week, and they're even looking at moving project management as a capability under the service management office in their organization. In essence, this is becoming, as organizations evolve, the enterprise service management or enterprise excellence organization that focuses on improving flow and optimization of value generation across multiple different frameworks and domains. So this isn't the be-all and end-all of all enterprise functions, but what we're seeing is that it's definitely gaining traction in this context of focusing on customer value improvement over time, leveraging multiple frameworks, using COVID, using ITIL, using TOGAF, whatever that might be, to actually achieve this. The most recent thing, which I think is very important, and again, a conversation I had last week, was that I see that that lean thinking and lean, the ability to run Kaizen events and identify how to improve the lead time premise is a critical skill within this. So Kaizen lead skill sets would be another element that enters into the service management office. So this is kind of a stage 3. It's not the final stage, but this is where many organizations now are finding themselves in what they're actually calling a service management office. I'm going to step back a little bit now and talk about services, because in the context of process, that's something that is easy to understand. So I think about, disaster recovery. I think about financial management and service-based costing. I think about availability, capacity management. I think about service level management, change, release. All of these things make sense in the context of improving the process or practice area. Another element I want to bring to your mind, though, is I want to explore the concept of service owner, because it is important that we talk about services and service owner in the context of process and process owner, and where would that apply and sometimes not apply to a service management office structure or function. So let's begin again, back at the beginning, understanding that a service is simply a means for delivering value customers want without asking them to worry about the specific details. Okay, so it's something we provide that provides a value that someone needs to own. Because if someone doesn't own it, again, that's the premise of who's watching the care and feeding of it, who's making sure that it's compelling over time, who's making sure that the menu items on your menu for your restaurant continue to be the ones people want to buy at the price point they want to buy it at. Well, in that context, I want to introduce you to a key element that ITIL doesn't necessarily go into in great detail, but other sources of knowledge. One of the sources I could reference you to is a book that I'm a co-author on called Building Success Through the Service Catalog, and it goes into the context of different types of services. So the top category is probably what springs to your mind when you think services. And in this context, we can think of a business service or an IT service supporting a business process. So we think of online banking, we think of deep water drilling, we think of power generation, and then more generically, we think of things like file print, messaging, collaboration. These are the things that typically come to your mind. This concept of an outcome, either it's a direct consumed or a supporting, like hosting or a storage service that IT provides. And these, of course, have service owners. But there's another category of services that it's important to focus on, and that's the professional service structure. That's the list you see at the bottom, or examples of. Now, think about professional services like this. So here's all the technology services that you deliver directly or indirectly to your business or consumer. But there's all that stuff that you do every day that makes it all run, that it keeps it running and makes it better going forward. So in this context, these are what are considered professional services. They have cost, they have value, and someone's got to own them. So project management, information security, procurement, these are as much a set of services with outcomes as the technical or business services above them. Now here's the kind of mind shift for you. I want you to think about all those ITIL processes: change management, release management, incident management. Would it not be appropriate to also think of those as professional services? Yes, they're called processes, but they have outcomes, they have value, they have cost, they have ownership. So in that context, many of the things that we think about in ITIL are actually also equally professional services. Some of these services make sense to put in an SMO, these professional services. The technical and business ones we're going to see may not be as good as a candidate. So this kind of, begs the question. So what does fit under the service management office function? Because I've made the comment that, overall governance can fit there, but it's also possible that process ownership can also be collected in this structure. And that's a true statement. What we typically see is that certain processes that have more of an enterprise oversight and purview definitely make sense to move here. And I see there's one question here is, where do you see release management often fitting? Well, in my experience, release management can either be here in the SMO because it's a non-biased, or should be non-biased, objective requirement setting or a group that defines what production assurance requirements are and how to deploy them. But I've also seen release management in a pre-production kind of quality function. But then you could argue, is there a conflict of interest? So often I will find change and release gravitate to the SMO. Other ones you see in here are like asset and configuration, or service level, or service catalog. All of these make perfect sense to be kind of in this central enterprise function as an owner. And remember now, because I've got dedicated resources, you might have one person who owns more than one process, and that's fine as long as they can handle it from a capacity perspective and the processes themselves are not conflicting. Other processes, though, would not necessarily make sense to move here. So my strategy processes, probably not financial management, probably not business relationship management, probably not portfolio management. You may not find supplier management in here because it might be its own function. We're going to see that in a few minutes in another slide. You may find that architecture, for example, not a good fit here because it has a different focus from a technical and business perspective. So it's not that the SMO grows to basically encompass all process ownership. That's not the case at all. But there are some processes that make a lot of sense, especially the tactical and transactional and measurement type of processes, like service level management, make a lot of sense to move here. Now, in my experience as well, people name this group differently. So the service management office is kind of a generic term, but I've been in organizations where they wanted to use more of a relevant term from a business value perspective. And one of the most early examples of service management office was actually called the high availability team, or the service excellence function. So what often happens is these teams take on the name of their goal. And that's actually not a bad thing, because that definitely, in the name itself, kind of demonstrates the value proposition that it's going for. So, you don't have to call it an SMO or a service management office. It's kind of a popular name, but it's not necessarily the recommended approach. So other things that could come in here, and again, these are question marks, organizational change competencies, training, as I mentioned earlier, project. I had that conversation just last week with one of the senior leaders that was looking at this. I'm not saying these are, things that should or should not happen, but it's a question, where do they go? So in this context, where do we normally find these roles living? So here's an example. So in this view, what you're looking at here is that you have a service model. Some services are like the business application-oriented service has a direct relationship to enabling a business process. Hosting is an indirect. You have another service called desktop or office automation, and each of these would have a service owner. The process, that's could be called a process owner, could be called a service owner. I've just kind of made an argument you could call them all service owners, but we don't want to confuse too much. But the reality is that processes also span. So where do we normally see these gravitate to? So in my experience, and also my recommendation, is you're trying to pull your process owners into more of an enterprise function. So that's where many of them make sense to move to this now new emerging enterprise structure called a service management office. But as I mentioned a moment ago, that's not necessarily healthy for all of your processes, but more and more, especially the ones which have a general purview over multiple groups, makes sense to move there. Portfolio specifically would be an example of not something I would do there, because in that context, that's a strategy process, and it's not necessarily that's trying to govern activities on a daily basis across structure. Service owners, on the other hand, and it comes down specifically to the business and technical services I was focusing on, the business or enabling services on this graph. I find in my personal experience and recommendation that those are best left within the existing technical domains, because that service owner has to maintain a relevancy on the technology which is basically making up predominance of that service outcome. Though any service, of course, is made up of assets across multiple groups and teams, you'll still find that there's a predominance that you'll find that belongs in one structure. So typically what will happen is that the service owner for that will be in that structure. In this example, if it's an application-oriented, let's say it's ERP, so Enterprise Resource Planning, the service owner will probably be in the SAP or Oracle Financials or JD Edwards group, right? That's going to be something of a normal fit. The service desk or desktop automation, you're going to find that in the infrastructure team somewhere. Hosting, likewise. The business relationship manager, kind of a role that we see emerging as well, typically not in the SMO, usually in its own team structure, reporting to an executive team. So coming to the end, and I'm going to leave some time for questions here, but let's move on to the next and final step, because I mentioned to you earlier that the SMO is really not the end state, but that we continue to see evolution in organizational design that basically says it's a furtherance of this kind of conversation. So here's a pattern that you might actually see happening in your own organization. So starting on the bottom left corner, organizations begin their journey around some kind of technical consolidation project. And I'm sure you've been part of these. You've been part of the data center consolidation project, or the standard desktop configuration and consolidation. You might be seeing your enterprise resource planning systems consolidated, and enterprise applications like messaging and collaboration now being consolidated. Now we're moving to virtualization, and that virtualization is now considering external cloud options. So we keep consolidating technical assets, initially primarily for the purpose of cost reduction. And that's not a bad thing, but not necessarily strategic around organizational design. But what happens, though, is that after you get through, the easy fruit, if you will, the low-hanging fruit on the hard cost, you start to see and start to realize you have a lot of redundancy in the softer side of things. So you see project management teams in multiple places. You might see audit or security in multiple teams. You might have 6 service desks strung across a larger organization. You might have various groups trying to do asset management, various groups basically managing change. And what you're seeing here is the challenge of redundancy and variability, which has the implications of our earlier conversation. So what begins to happen is that these groups begin to become consolidated as well. And so you start to see the emergence of a project management office, and it spins off outside of the existing function and now becomes an enterprise structure. Enterprise architecture, enterprise information security, and all of these little groups spin out into kind of a no man's land, because where do they report into? Well, they have to normally report into some senior leader, so they'll typically go into a senior VP or maybe right direct to the CIO. But what happens there is eventually what happens is you have too much of a span of control. There's too many direct reports, and it's not clear how they have purview. So what we see as a next stage is the emergence of a new structure, an enterprise structure focused on governance and delivery across the organization. And a third new tower begins to emerge. So you have development tower, you have the operations tower. Now you have service delivery or governance. Some kind of name emerges around it. And there's a final one we'll come back to in a minute, but I want to kind of give you a visual of what this looks like. So here's the example. We've recognized that the service concept and the process concept are agnostic to structure. They span structure, not even just internal structure, but external structure. And what we've seen is the spin out of all these now to the left enterprise functions, and they begin to emerge and coalesce underneath now this new tower. Call it service delivery, that's just a name I've put up there. They begin managing the relationship direct to the customer, enabling, by the way, your sourcing strategy for development and operations to be much more flexible and agile. Because one of the challenges we have today with doing strategic sourcing is we don't have necessarily the governance structure or function in place to hold and glue together the complexity of our supplier model without this. Now note the top of the list on the left. Our little service management office started as this little service management team, now is emerging as one of several enterprise functions in this structure. And the interesting thing is, again, this is not an explicit list, it's an example of the types of things you see moving to this now enterprise function that has its own senior leadership team on peer with the other towers. I'd like to say that's the end, but there's actually one more possible scenario. And that's where the business enterprise service management structure begins. And you might be in an organization where you see this, where business enterprise shared services begin to emerge. And now the question comes up, why do I have business risk and then IT risk? Or business finance and IT finance? Or the business call center, why is that really different than the internal IT service desk as far as goal and maybe even process and maybe even tool? So what you begin to see, even in this now the last stage, is that these enterprise IT functions in some part now begin to emerge and basically integrate into enterprise business services, which in one essence is kind of the goal. This delineation between business and IT and separation begins to basically de-evolve and disappear. So this kind of brings us to the last stage, is that today we have to understand that life cycle elements have to be managed and governed. And so I probably could visit your organization today and I could say, okay, show me who owns the data, and you'll point me to the person who oversees the DBA group or specific business unit type functions that own the data for specific systems. I'll say, show me someone who owns the network or the database or the server environment, and you'll point me to someone who's doing the care and feeding for that. Show me someone who owns an application, and I'm probably pretty sure that you'll show me, Barb, Jim, and Jane, and these are the application owners, and they have a life cycle kind of concept, care and feeding for the application. But now the challenge begins. What about process life cycle? Who's owning the care and feeding of that? How's that working when you only have it established within existing functional structures and silos? Even the system concept, where now I look at like the SAP system or Exchange system, where the application is only one element of that system, one component of the system. Who is kind of providing a lifecycle perspective of that system, its upgrades and retirement? And of course, then systems all feed into outcomes called services. Who is looking at enterprise resource planning or CRM or collaboration or hosting? Our challenge today is that we have a huge gap often in many organizations around individual people and owners who have been given the accountability and the enablement to govern and to plan the life cycle to make sure that these services and systems and processes continue to meet needs now and in the future. This is one of the gaps we have when implementing improvements in service management. So hopefully this session has provided some context for you around that kind of evolving service organization. I'm going to take a moment to look through some of the questions here to see if I can answer them for you. Put my glasses on so I can read this. Okay, so starting at the top. So is it possible to get a copy of the slides? The deck will be in the recording. And if you wish, you can send me an email. You see my email here, and I can provide a PDF version of the slides as well. So that's something that I can offer as a service. The recording will be downloaded in the next couple of days, and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can share this audio recording as well, which of course includes the visuals. So where do you classically see release management in the structure? And I kind of touched on that. Typically, you'll find it in 3 different locations. Historically, before a service management office, you'll see it in a pre-production group like a quality assurance function. Sometimes I see it, especially if release is being brought in, as more of a deployment focus. And release and deploy are different, by the way. Release is production assurance activities up until the point of move to production, meaning do you have your checklist requirements all completed before you try to go to production. Deployment is now let's package it and push it. And people will confuse deployment with release, which are 2 different activities. And actually also sometimes in different groups, by the way. Well, release on a production assurance side will often be found in that QA group, sometimes in a production handover type of group that's just one step to the right of the production line. But I find that it's most effective when it moves to this enterprise service management team or office. And deployment, by the way, might be a technical team that does the packaging and for service orchestration and automation. What is the role of the ITSM executive versus the process owner? So that's going back to that governance picture where I showed a process owner, a council at the next level, and an executive. And the process owners are making up that council. I mentioned all their members potentially be a tool member and potentially audit, but they are not senior executives necessarily. They are probably people who have the time in life to basically do the care and feeding for the process, but they are responsible to a senior team. These are often people who are the heads of operation or the head of development teams, might be also, head of architecture type of council, and they are the executive team, and they receive the dashboard from the service management council. They receive the justification for business case and return on investment analysis from that group of process owners. They're the executive team that will call attention to something that needs to be improved if it's strategically a goal, or they're the approvers on large-scale phase improvements and funding models. So the next question, when just starting out like our company is, would you see a single process owner for change, incident, problem, or breaking it up into multiple process owners? Okay, so the question really comes at 2 different levels. So there are some processes which are high transactional volume, meaning the number of transactions going through this process is very high. So incident management is a high transactional process. Change management, again. Configuration management updates, again, high. In that context, giving one person too many of these high transactional process areas would be overwhelming and would be a capacity issue. You could do change and release together because they have similar frequency of transaction, in fact, very connected. One of the interesting ones to note, and the other perspective to take on this question, is that some processes are actually contradictory in their goals. And one of the classic ones often is incident and problem. Now, on the surface, you might think that's a marriage made in heaven, but what happens, and I've lived this life myself when I was a service desk manager at one point in my career, is you have an incident team, and then you have a problem management team over here trying to do root cause analysis, and you have the same resources doing both in one example. What in my experience happens is that the incident overcomes the problem objective. You're always stamping out fires, you're reacting to the urgent and never getting enough time and kind of stand back opportunity to look at it from a more longer term perspective, from a problem management perspective. So in that context, if that team was the same, I wouldn't recommend incident problem being combined together. However, if it's a senior leader and now they have an incident team with a service desk manager over here and a problem team that's doing it over here on the right, and these teams are not converged, then that could happen. That could be a very possible good pairing. But the interesting dilemma now is, how do you keep that segregated? Because it's important to do that, to keep it both processes going and both healthy. So that's the end of the questions, folks, that I have here. And I think I see one more just came in. You mentioned combining responsibility for change, configuration, release, deployment within a single role. I did, but here's the challenge. The question is capacity, not so much the goals and objectives. If you had, again, a senior manager over all three, and then that senior manager had a direct report, each of which was responsible for the three, or one that was over change and release and a separate one over config, I can see that happening. It's more about capacity than conflict in this context. It's a good question, though, Chris. Well, folks, I hopefully you found this session to be informative and useful. Again, if you'd like to follow, I write a lot of this down on my blog. In fact, I have a podcast called Practitioner Radio, which I've been doing for several years with some of my counterparts here at Pink Elephant. Many of the topics we've discussed today, even this one, is covered in the podcasts that we do called Practitioner Radio as well. And so I recommend taking a look at those. Again, thank you for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.